The big global consulting firms have long dominated the ERP and digital transformation space, but their time has come to an end. That's what we're going to talk about here today. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world reach the third stage of digital transformation success. And I started my career 25 years ago at one of the big consulting firms, PricewaterhouseCoopers to be exact. And the big consulting firms have been around for a long time. They've long dominated the enterprise technology space. Companies like PricewaterhouseCoopers, Deloitte, Accenture, KPMG, Capgemini. Those are just a few examples of some of the really big global consulting firms that have hundreds of thousands of employees at each of them and have long dominated the tech consulting space. But now that the world is changing, I'm starting to question the viability of this large consulting business model, and I'll talk about why that is here today. Now, while I'm going to share a lot of information about system integrators and large consulting firms here in general, I also want to invite you to download our annual digital transformation report. This is a great way to learn more about the industry, including the types of system integrators, the types of consulting firms that are out there for you to choose from, as well as the different types of software solutions that you might look into. The report also contains a number of best practices and lessons to ensure that your digital transformation or ERP project is successful. So I encourage you to download that report, which you can find right here with this QR code in front of you, or you can go to the links below. One of the biggest challenges and the biggest faults of big consulting firms is their biases. They are extremely biased towards certain software solutions. And this is something I learned really early in my career, and it's something that hasn't changed at all in the last 25 years that I've been doing this. Just to give you a quick example and a personal story here, back in the late 90s when I started at Pricewaterhouse, I remember my first software evaluation and selection project. And we were paid around $1 million for this project was the estimated fees. And this was one of my first projects coming straight out of grad school while I was at Pricewaterhouse. And I remember distinctly sitting down with the project team that was on this project. Most of them were older and more experienced than me. But I remember asking, which systems are we going to evaluate? What technologies are we going to consider for this client? And I was actually pretty excited to learn about different technologies that were in the enterprise tech space. And I got a very strange look when I asked the question. I remember the team looking at me almost as though I was speaking a foreign language or saying something that was completely crazy. And I remember the partner on the project telling me, there's no decision to make. We are recommending SAP. Now we need to spend the next 6 months justifying why we need to recommend SAP to this client. And I remember thinking it just didn't feel right. I felt a little bit dirty because I knew I was getting paid, the whole company was getting paid a lot of money to go through this evaluation and the selection and the set of recommendations. And we knew from day one that we were going to recommend SAP. And the reason we were going to recommend SAP is because the group that I was involved with was underneath the same management of the SAP practice. And so the way the business worked, at least in the part of Pricewaterhouse that I worked for at the time, was that the teams that would do the software evaluation in the separate group over here were incentivized to sell and recommend SAP, which benefited this practice over here. And the two partners that were over each of those areas actually benefited from both of those. I believe the partner I worked for was incentivized and comped on how much SAP work that the other partner sold. So there's a lot of biases and misalignment and conflicts of interest that went along with that. And that's one of the big problems I have with the big consulting firms. And in fact, it was the origin of my original idea of starting an independent and tech agnostic ERP consulting firm. I actually first came up with that idea back in the late 90s. When I started at Pricewaterhouse and during my tenure at Pricewaterhouse. Now, I assumed that over time, maybe there were other independent consulting firms out there I just didn't know about, or maybe this was just a problem with PricewaterhouseCoopers, but other firms weren't like that. But what I found over the next 10 years in my career after that was that that's just how the consulting space works. Consultants oftentimes either are incentivized to recommend certain solutions because they have big practices that focus on that solution, and/or they're getting commissions from the software vendors to make the recommendations that benefit that software vendor. And we get approached all the time at Third Stage Consulting, vendors that want to offer us 10 or 20% of the revenue that they generate from our recommendations, and we give them a solid, stern no every time because we are independent and agnostic. So those biases that you see in the big consulting space is something that I don't think is sustainable, and I think it's something that will hurt the larger consulting firms in the longer term. Another reason why I think the big consulting model is not sustainable is because of the conflicts of interest that are inherent in the business model. Now, I talked about how many of the big consulting firms are incentivized financially to recommend certain products, and they benefit financially for that, and that in and of itself is a conflict of interest. But there's other conflicts of interest as well. One is that the big consulting firms have a pretty steep incentive to get as many bodies billable on your project as soon as possible. And it may sound normal enough. It doesn't sound like a big surprise. There's not necessarily anything wrong with that. That's their job, is to generate revenue for their organization. But your job as a CIO or as an organization that's investing in technology consultants to deploy technology, your job is to make sure that you're not minimizing cost, but optimizing cost and making the best use of those resources. And I remember distinctly when I was at the big 5 consulting firms back in the 90s, I remember having many internal conversations that we intentionally excluded the client from, where we were at the client site billing for our time, strategizing about how we could get more people on the project. In fact, that's how I got on my very first project at Pricewaterhouse. Is I had just come out of grad school, I had just gone through initial training, had never touched an ERP system in my life, had never been a consultant in my life until that moment. And I was put on a project where I didn't have anything to do for several months. It took a long time for me to get up to where I was actually working a full-time job. And during that time, I was expected to bill at least 50 to 60 hours. So I was billing for dead time because I was incentivized and I was expected and pressured to bill as much time as possible, even if I wasn't adding value. So that conflict of interest isn't in the interest of the client, but it certainly helps the big consulting firms. And another way that we see this conflict of interest manifest itself is that when you get a mid-size organization that's not a big Fortune 500 company, but they're a decent-sized organization, the big consulting firms will treat it like a big Fortune 500 company, and they'll try to staff it the same way. So let's just say they have some clients that are 100 billion or more in revenue, and they might put 200 people full-time on those sorts of projects. They'll try to put as many people as possible, or as close to 200 people as they can, on a mid-market company that might only be $5 billion. And that's just not cost-effective. It doesn't add value to the client. And long-term, customers are starting to figure this out, and that's why I think this model is outdated, and I don't think it's going to last very long. If there's one area where organizations in general have wisened up as it relates to enterprise technology projects and investments, it's that they're starting to recognize and realize that these big consulting firms are training grounds for new consultants. And that's okay. That's how I started my career. I got great training working at Pricewaterhouse, but I did a lot of that training on the dime of clients that were paying the consulting firm I worked for to train me. And a lot of that was on the job training. A lot of that was just my own inefficiency because I didn't know what I was doing when I first started. And so that's the kind of thing that I think will undermine the value that these big consulting firms provide to customers. In fact, they've always been undermining the value of that, but customers are now starting to see that and realize that. In today's day and age of AI and self-learning and self-development and professional development, CIOs and C-level executives are starting to recognize and understand that there's no need to have super junior people on a project doing documentation or doing research when a lot of that can be automated with AI and other technologies. So that's another reason why I think that the big consulting model is somewhat flawed and limited and inevitably will see its demise, or at least some sort of major pivot in the future. Big consulting firms come with big price tags. I'm not just talking about the rates that they charge by the hour for a daily rate for the consulting services, but I'm also talking about the overall cost. And this goes back to a point I made earlier in this video where I talk about how there's a conflict of interest in terms of the big consulting firms putting an immense amount of pressure on their employees to put as many people as possible on any given project. This just jacks up the cost and raises the cost of the project. And big consulting firms are really good at playing politics and ensuring that the client doesn't necessarily understand or know how resources are being directed and the value that individual resources on a project are delivering to a project. What they do instead is they'll usually have a senior manager or a partner who's sort of the face of the team that will do all the interaction with the executive sponsors and the executive steering committee, and they do a really good job of selling the value of the team as a whole. But having been part of these teams and having still been involved with these teams now as an external third-party independent consulting firm, we see it all the time, where these big consulting firms put bodies on projects, but there's not necessarily any rationalization or validation of whether or not we need all those resources at that time. A lot of times what happens is these firms are so hell-bent on staffing up the project as quickly as possible and as fast as possible, as much as possible, that they put bodies on projects and ramp it up at a certain run rate that's not sustainable for that project long term. So in other words, you might have staffing levels like this, but really you might be able to get by with a lot less of a staff at a slower burn over a longer period of time. So those are the sorts of things you need to look at. Is you need to have visibility into the project plan, the resourcing plan, the budget, the staffing forecast for the project, and the way the consulting firm is managing their people. And this goes back to a point I make often in my videos and other thought leadership, in that organizations that are going through the implementation and hire these big consulting firms, or any consulting firm for that matter, they need to take ownership of the project, and they need to manage those consultants the way they would manage any other employee or contractor or vendor. For some reason, organizations feel like they don't know enterprise technology, so they just defer to the big consulting firms, and big consulting firms are highly likely to take advantage of that in most cases. Now, this is probably the most controversial point I'll make in this video, and that is these big consulting firms are oftentimes very arrogant. They have a superiority complex that oftentimes leads them to look down on people that are not part of their team or the client themselves. And what that does is it leads to a lack of transparency with the client. So these big consulting firms, as a broad generalization, are good at telling customers what they want to hear. They're good at isolating them from issues that might be percolating under the surface. They're good at hiding inefficiencies of their own team. They're good at hiding mistakes that the team might be making. And what happens is organizations pay for this in the end when they find out that the project is off the rails, that they weren't notified of certain risks that were happening, and in many cases the fox was guarding the hen house. And this is why a lot of organizations will hire us as an independent tech agnostic firm to provide quality assurance and oversight and management of these big system integrators, because we are not only good project managers, but we also know what it takes to staff these projects appropriately, and we're only paid by the customers, our clients themselves. So our only incentive is making sure that the client is successful, and that transparency and that ownership is something that we give to clients, and that's something that they need, whether you hire a company like us or not. But I'm curious to hear what you think, especially if you've worked for a big consulting firm, if you've hired a big consulting firm. I'm curious to hear what you think. Do you think the business value is there? Do you think there's flaws in the business model? Am I crazy? Is there positive aspects of this that I'm missing here? I do think there's value in what big consulting firms can bring to the table, but I also think there's a lot of downside risk, and I don't think that downside risk is sustainable. So I'm curious to hear what you think, though. Is there something I'm missing? Is the benefit outweigh the cost and the risk? I'd love to hear your comments below, so be sure to leave those. I'd love to hear your feedback. So I hope you found this information useful, and I hope you have a great day. I'm wondering if the time has come. No, that's a dead-end sentence. I would remember, well, I don't remember what I remember. They have a superior, that word is so hard to say. There certainly are, let me start with the, I am rambling so much.
Bit, yeah.
They have a superiority complex.